Hello, everybody. Boop, 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 boom.
Welcome back.
Boop, boom.
Episode 2, Stranger Stories, where we explore throughout the summer the strange
Boop, boom.
stories
Boop, boom.
of Scripture.
Boop, boom. Yes, in light of the Stranger Things theme, is kind of the whole premise for this series. So just to review, we're changing up things a lot in how we do Sunday mornings, especially because we're in a college town. A lot of our people are gone.
Yep.
So we're taking the months of June and July and doing it more like workshop-y style for us to learn how to read the Bible, especially how to read these really strange stories. So in light of us doing more workshop style on Sunday mornings, Mason and I are doing these little podcast episodes just to kind of fill in the
Boom.
Just to make up for that. So you guys can listen in, follow along as we read these strange stories while teaching you how to read the Bible. So just to review, we've introduced this three dubs method. We're calling it the three dubs method because there are three W's, three questions we primarily ask as we go through these scriptures. The first question is what, Mason?
What?
See, I gave you the answer in the question. The first question is what? What is going on is often filled with observations of the text, like where is this passage taking place in the book of the Bible, and why is that book important in knowing, how we read this passage? What is the setting? Who are the characters? What actions are taking place? What really sticks out to you about the passage? Where is God in this story? Where is sin in this story? And what questions really puzzle you from that, right? Like we ask the what question to gain a good understanding of what's going on, right? And from there, after we talk in length about the things that really stick out and getting a good grasp on the passage itself, we move into the next question, which is
So what?
So what? So what? What's the big deal? Why, essentially? Why is this significant? When you go back over your observations and the questions you ask, you try to answer them. And you're asking, what does this reveal to me about God and his plan? What does this reveal to us about humans? And why is this story important? Because the more and more you ask why in these strange stories, the more you eventually get to the eternal nuggets of truth that can apply to humanity across cultures, across timelines.
Love me some eternal nuggets.
Eternal nuggets, yes. AKA Chick-fil-A chicken nuggets.
No.
Right? No, just kidding. So out of that, you find these eternal principles that can even speak to us today. And that leads us to our last question, which is...
Now what?
Now what? What do you do? What do you do with
for
this?
For the readers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How does it apply to your life? How does it apply to your life? And how do you walk away with the necessary changes ready to move forward? So we're going to do this again. We're going to revisit the passage that we talked about on Sunday. And this passage is a fun one. You know why?
Hesitations 3:16?
Nope. We're turning to Leviticus chapter 14.
Ooh.
Hesitations is not the book of the Bible, just so you know. We're going to Leviticus chapter 14, verses 33 through 53. And today, we're talking about mold.
I didn't know what we were going to talk about. I just know that we were going to read about Leviticus, and he said mold, and I just chuckled. I just chuckled on the inside.
We're reading about mold.
What does mold have
and
to do with
mildew?
With learning about God and learning about
man.
Scripture? And
that's why this is so strange. So let's dive into it. Mason, if you want to read to us the word of the Lord, Leviticus chapter 14, verses 33 through 53. There is a lot here. This is extremely boring, but hold on to your seats, folks.
Hold on to your seats and hold on to your hats.
Let's go.
Leviticus 14:33. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, When you come into the land of Canaan, which I give for you a possession, and I put a case of leprous disease in a house in the land of your possession, then he who owns the house shall come and tell the priest, There seems to me to be some case of disease in my house. Then the priest shall command that they empty the house before the priest goes to examine the disease, lest all that is in the house be declared unclean. Sounds like asbestos. Right?
Yeah, my translation says mildew.
Okay, yeah. And afterward, the priest shall go in to see the house, And he shall examine the disease, and if the disease is in the walls of the house with greenish or reddish spots, and if it appears to be deeper than the surface, then the priest shall go out of the house to the door of the house and shut up the house 7 days. And the priest shall come again on the 7th day and look. If the disease has spread in the walls of the house, then the priest shall command that they take out the stones in which is the disease and throw them into an unclean place outside the city. And he shall have the inside of the house scraped all around, and the plaster that they scrape off they shall pour out in an unclean place outside the city. Then they shall take other stones and put them in the place of those stones, and he shall take other plaster and plaster the house. If the disease breaks out again in the house, after he has taken out the stones and scraped the house and plastered it, then the priest shall go look, and if the disease has spread in the house, it is a persistent leprous disease in the house, it is unclean. And he shall break down the house, its stones and timber, and all the plaster of the house, and he shall carry them out of the city to an unclean place. Moreover, whoever enters the house while it is shut up shall be unclean until the evening. And whoever sleeps in the house shall wash his clothes, and whoever eats in the house shall wash his clothes. But if the priest comes and looks, and if the disease has not spread in the house after the house was plastered, then the priest shall pronounce the house clean, for the disease is healed. And for the cleansing of the house he shall take 2 small birds with cedar wood and scarlet yarn and hyssop, and shall kill one of the birds in an earthenware vessel over fresh water, and shall take the cedar wood and the hyssop and the scarlet yarn along with the live bird, and dip them in the blood of the bird that was killed in the fresh water, and in the fresh water, and sprinkle the house 7 times. Thus he shall cleanse the house with the blood of the bird, and with the fresh water, and with the live bird, and with the cedar wood and hyssop and scarlet yarn. And he shall let the live bird go out of the city into the open country. So he shall make atonement for the house, and it shall be clean. Strange.
So strange, right? Y'all still there? Y'all
Yarn,
awake?
cedar wood, hyssop, dead bird, live bird, fresh water, earthenware vessel,
Blood,
blood.
let alone mildew, or if in Mason's translation, your house has a disease.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
Yes.
Okay, so we just did the reading. Lots of strangeness going on here. So we have to ask the question, what is going on?
Mhm.
What's going on? So, Mason, what are some initial observations that you make from this passage as you read it?
Yeah. Well, the first is the Lord speaking to Moses and Aaron.
Who are Moses and Aaron?
So if you are a Christian or a Jew even, you're probably really familiar with who Moses is. Incredibly familiar. A little bit less so with Aaron, but they're brothers.
Mm-hmm.
And Aaron is ends up being the one that kind of speaks for Moses, because Moses is slow to speak in a sense, or slow of speech. And Moses is that guy who talked to God on Mount Sinai after leaving Egypt, and they're 2 of the big figures in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
The Mosaic covenant, the Aaronic benediction, so all sorts of things.
So very important guys.
Yes. Yeah, and Moses was on the mountain during the Transfiguration, right?
Yes,
Yes.
He was.
Right.
So basically the head honchos of
Yes.
the
Of the
Israelites.
right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so the Lord is speaking to them, and he says, when you come into the land of Canaan, which I give you, and I put a case of leprous disease. It's interesting that God puts it there.
Oh, isn't that interesting? Yeah, my translation says, when you arrive in Canaan, the land I'm giving to you is your own possession. So this is the instructions he's giving the priests before they arrive into the promised land. My translation says, I may contaminate some of the houses in your land with mildew.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah. I mean, that's just such a weird thing for God to do, right?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, when you think of God, you think of the one who created the world. You think of the one who brings justice on those who sin against him, the one who brings salvation to those who call on his name and follow him. And he's also the God who contaminates houses with mildew, which is a really weird way to put that. Yeah, that's so odd.
That's a great question. We'll tack that onto our list of questions,
Right.
that we can then interpret.
Like, why mildew? Why is he contaminating houses in the first place if they're gonna just end up cleaning the houses and scraping them and replastering them and re-stoning them, or even just destroying them in the first in at the end?
Yeah,
They're still full of mildew and asbestos and whatever, whatever it might be.
Yeah, that's a great question. We'll come back and we'll answer that
Yeah.
here in a little bit.
But these are houses that haven't been built yet because they're going into the land of Canaan eventually.
Mhm.
Right? And so God says, if you find a house that I have contaminated, clean it up. Do what you can to scrape all of it off. And if after a number of days, 7 specifically, why 7 days, right?
Mm-hmm.
7 is a very important number in the Bible. Why 7 days for this mildew or why 7 days for us to wait until we can see whether or not the house has mildew or the mildew is gone. And there's a really strange series of ordinances, commandments for us to follow, or for the Israelites to follow, the priests to follow.
Yeah.
In order to clean these houses.
Yeah. Well, and what's really interesting to me, this is something that pops off the page to me. If you have a problem with your house, who are you going to call?
Ghostbusters.
I knew that was coming. You're going to call an inspector. You're going to call someone who is like trained, to handle this stuff.
Yeah.
The Israelites are commanded to call their priest.
Yeah.
Their pastor.
Yeah.
Like that'd be the equivalent of if you got like insects or something crazy with your house, you're calling Mason or I to come deal with that problem. Don't do that. We have no clue what we're doing. I would probably make it worse, So why?
A couple months ago. Well, not more than a couple. It was my first couple months here. I had fleas in my carpet.
Oh, that's right. You did.
And I made this makeshift flea trap with a cookie dish, water, and dish soap.
That's right.
And I caught like maybe 7 or 8.
There you
go. But they all eventually died off. I know there was much more than 7 or 8.
Take that back. If you have a flea infestation with your house, you can call Mason.
Yeah. But it is interesting that they call the priests.
Yeah.
It's as if they didn't have exterminators or people who, were sharp on those things.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's because Yahweh commanded that the priest do these things.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that communication between Moses and Aaron and Yahweh, it was very clear as to what the priests were to deal with and to not deal with.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm. For sure. And here's where asking this key question, and we can go through all the nitty-gritty details of they have to quarantine the house, and the people who are living there have to quarantine another 7 days themselves so that they can be restored and be made clean again. Because by being in this house, they are ceremonially unclean. We see this word come up, ceremonially clean and unclean.
Yep.
What's going on with that phrasing?
Right. Why is it that if you wait until the evening, then you're clean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why is the city outside of the city that they're currently in unclean? What makes that city unclean?
Yes. Oh boy. And that is a theme that you see pop up it's throughout scripture in the Old Testament, but specifically in Leviticus, because this is where if you zoom out now, and I'm not telling you that you have to read the entire book of Leviticus to understand this one passage because it would put you to sleep. But as we've talked about in weeks prior, look up the Bible Project, watch the 10-minute video overviewing the book of Leviticus. What you find is that this book is basically the job description of the priests, the job description of the Levites who were who lived full time as the spiritual backbone of God's people.
Right.
And because God is a completely holy God and a perfect God and a good God, and he wants to live in relationship with a very sinful and broken and unclean people,
Mm-hmm.
there were all of these things they had to do to make sure that the people were in good standing to live in relationship with God.
Right.
I mean, this includes all of the sacrifices. Includes the type of offerings they were to give and all of this other stuff. But it also meant that there were all these crazy rituals that the priests had to do whenever the people interacted in sin. Or what we find is this passage is in the middle of like 4 or 5 chapters talking about like how the priests were to attend to like skin diseases, skin rashes, boils on your head, purification processes after a woman gives birth, many other things. And so this is just like one instance of being exposed to a potentially dangerous disease at the cause of mold in a home.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yes.
how these people can live and be clean.
Right.
And what we find here, and you're probably wondering, just like everybody else, let's go to the so what question. Why in the world is this passage important? And what we discover is, well, I'll turn it over to you, Mason. Why do you think this passage in particular is important? What's significant about the principles that we find here in these 20 verses
Right.
of mildew?
Well, I mean, obedience is significant, right? Ideally, you'd want if you're God, you'd want the Israelites to obey your command. Another thing I find interesting is that he gives a command in case someone does break a command, which is whoever enters the house while it is shut up shall be unclean until the evening.
Yeah.
Like he says that knowing that, people might break it.
Yeah.
And so, obedience is very significant. Cleansing is very significant in this passage. And atonement is a key theme in the very last verse in this particular selection, in verse 53, Leviticus 14:53. He shall let the live bird go out of the city into the open country. So he shall make atonement for the house, and it shall be clean. Atonement is a very clear picture or theme. Cleansing blood is another clear theme as to what's going on in this passage. It's a clear importance. Blood, a life being taken for the blood to spill and clean something, right?
Which it just seems like it just makes it messy still. You're putting blood on the house. But but it is this deeper spiritual cleansing, that the death of this animal takes the place of the death that we would deserve for being unclean.
Right.
And so it is a signifying, this act is signifying the cleanliness that God is restoring on this house. And like, let's keep asking the why question. Because again, we keep asking why to get to that eternal nugget of truth that can apply to us. Why would God tell his people to do all of these rules that probably they didn't even understand why they had to do them?
Yeah.
To obey them. They didn't know why. They just had to obey it. Why would he ask them to do these particular sets of commands for this house?
Well, I can imagine for one, he wouldn't want his people to get sick and die.
Yeah.
Mildew apparently can cause a lot of issues. I've never had mildew in a home before. But primarily, the Lord wants faithful obedience. Why is this important? This is just one Levitical way by which the Israelites follow God and obey his commandments.
Yeah. And you nailed it on the head, and I was really hoping you would bring this up, is the whole purpose for this command is for us to be healthy. It's about physical health. It's why, this little passage is found in this whole other slew of a couple other chapters talking about skin diseases and like how to treat them and how to get clean again. Because as God is preparing this people to enter into the promised land and becoming a civilization of their own, I mean, they had no clue that medicine existed. They didn't know what this disease really was or how it worked. God did. And instead of giving them vaccines and antibodies and Pepto-Bismol or whatever to treat the stuff, he gives them all these other things that apply to their time, and extended quarantines, and because we all know how those go. Those are pretty fresh in our minds still, even 3 years after COVID. But he gives them all this because it is to protect his people,
right?
To keep them well.
Mm-hmm.
And and that just goes to show that obeying God isn't just a spiritual matter. It's also a physical matter.
Yeah.
And the Hebrews did not view the human body as segmented, as if our intellect is one thing, our emotions are one thing, and our spiritual life is another thing. They viewed the human person as a holistic person. Mm-hmm. We are simultaneously emotional, physical, spiritual people. Mm-hmm. And why this is all important, like what this reveals to me about human nature is, we need to do whatever we can to be well. Because God loves health, and he gives us commands, and he gave his people commands to be well. And what's interesting in this particular passage is that it also gives us spiritual importance to caring for our homes.
Right.
How quick are we when we have an issue with our home or with an apartment or whatever? Like when we're sick, we always pray for our health, but like if we have an issue with our home, are we just as quick to invite God into that process? To ask God to help cleanse,
a flea problem.
the flea problems, or like this seems like so minor in comparison, but I'm trying to, and now we're kind of moving into the now what question. Like, how do we apply this to our own lives? But like, I have a lawn that I want to reseed because it was just festered with weeds in the backyard. Like, the Lord gives these people such clear commands of if there is something wrong with the house that could cause a lack of well-being, if not death, tear it down, rebuild it. And I also asked the question, the so what question, like, why does he care that much about these people's homes?
Yeah.
And to me, and kind of the application of that is the Lord cares about where we live and what we should do to foster that environment into a place that promotes well-being.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, directly from this passage, like obedience is clear, and purification with blood. And I mean, when we read Leviticus, we can get a very clear picture of why Jesus died the way he did, and why he had to die. And I just lost it. But that number 7 is also really important too, which I find awesome, because that 7 is indicative of completion. And the earth was made in 7 days, and there's 7 instances in which creation is declared good. And so it's really cool that 7 imagery continues. But we can read later in Hebrews, even in the New Testament, and this is the subtitle says "Redemption through the Blood of Christ," and we read about in Leviticus the bloody bird, the bloody bird, and when we read Hebrews, it tells us that we have eternal redemption through the blood of Christ, and says in Hebrews 9:11, and continuing, but when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is not of this creation, He entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves or birds, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more? Like what the author is saying, if those things can sanctify the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Therefore, he's the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant, which is what we read about in Leviticus. For where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop. Right?
There it is.
Or scarlet yarn, right?
Wow.
And sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant that God commanded for you." And in the same way, he sprinkled, this is Moses, sprinkled, or the priest, with the blood both the tent and all the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Thus, it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. In other words, those sacrifices sucked compared to what Christ did and who Christ is.
Yeah.
For Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood not his own, for then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself.
Dang.
And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him.
Man, the parallels are
yeah.
crazy.
And that's the exact picture that we get, from, that's what the author is, he says, thus it was necessary for the copies of these heavenly things to be purified with these rites. This purification, while the temple is the copy of the heavenly kingdom of God and God's dwelling place, the killing of birds or calves or goats or bulls was the copy or the even foretelling of Christ's sacrifice that didn't cleanse us for a while or whatever, but it cleansed us for for eternity.
Well, and that leads me kind of to this final question as we wrap up. This is the now what question. What do we do with this? Is in light of what you just shared, Mason, of how Christ's sacrifice is the ultimate sacrifice. It just makes all these other sacrifices unnecessary. What does that look like? Applying that passage from Leviticus we read in the goodness of Christ's sacrifices over our homes specifically. Because we talk all about how it restores the sin of our life, but in light of God caring for the health of our house and our home, from these and clearly doing the work on it necessary for us to live clean lives and physically healthy lives, what does living into Christ's redemptive work on the cross and applying that to our homes, our houses actually look like? Is that even significant? And if it is, why? And how do we live that out? What does that look like?
Yeah. I wrote a blog post a while ago about how I don't want my spiritual habits to mimic my house cleaning habits.
Ah.
I can tend to let the grime build up. And in the spiritual sense, what does that mean for us to let sin build up in our lives? And sometimes it's harder to clean those surfaces the more you let that stuff build up, the crud build up. But why try to work so hard and do things when Christ's blood has already washed us eternally?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we don't have to deal with sin anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It means that our conscience has been washed and we are cleansed, and we don't have to do rites or rituals anymore to clean ourselves.
Yeah.
And so
That's good.
for your house specifically, maybe that looks like cleaning your house regularly, knowing that like as you're cleaning, you have been washed by Christ's blood.
Yeah.
And if you continue to read in Hebrews, it says in Hebrews 10:3, but in these sacrifices there is a reminder of sins every year. And who wants that reminder? You know, like like we have this reminder that we have sinful inclinations, but we don't have to remember anymore our sinful selves, our past sinful selves. Instead, we're living in a new reality that's not characterized by sin, but it's characterized by obedience and a new covenant of blood that has been that has cleansed us eternally.
Yeah. That's good. For me, as I'm reflecting on that question, like the now what, as we've learned from this passage, how it has this applied to my own life, I reflected a lot on this passage recently, and like particularly when it comes to matters of the home and the household, whether it's mildew, infestation, or starting a new lawn or any other house project, like why should I not invite God into that? God is a God of place. He's everywhere, right? He cares for this earth, and that also includes our homes. So if he created us to be co-creators and co-workers with him, then we also need to steward our homes well, to care for them well, to keep them orderly, right? Just as you said, to attend to their needs, to clean them, because, and this is why I think it's important, and I think this is why, God would have us do this from this Leviticus passage. So much of our formation into God's image takes place at home and with the family and the friends who inhabit it.
Right.
And, all of this isn't just about, boosting your equity through house projects, although that is good stewardship for sure. Like, the premise here is that like where we live cultivates our well-being and spiritual formation into God's image in more ways than we could ever imagine. And so doing the necessary things to keep the place orderly and especially to keep it healthy so we can stay healthy. It just promotes a much healthier state of life that ultimately impacts like our attitudes, and which impacts our interactions with our family and how we raise our kids, and ultimately how we disciple our family into God's ways.
Yeah.
So kind of like the big takeaway I had from this passage is that caring for our homes can care for our souls.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. I tend to know that like I'm doing better spiritually in my soul as well, like when my space is clean.
Isn't that crazy? And it's because we are integrated physical, emotional, spiritual beings. Like they're not segmented into only what you do on Sunday morning or whatever. Like very much the environments we inhabit dictate who we become and how we view God. And knowing that we can invite God into the sacred space, knowing that Christ's death and sacrifice also impacts even the little things we do around the house that can cultivate a state of well-being. So with that, if I know that my wife's well-being is much better when I can help clean up the kitchen every single night, I should do that.
Yeah.
Like, it's nothing in comparison to infectious mildew that could kill you. But if we don't do the dishes, things are going to start growing on those dishes. And if we start eating the things that grow on those dishes, I'm going to get sick. And we don't want that.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? We don't want that. So caring for our homes can be caring for our souls. It promotes an environment where we can be at our healthiest and therefore can connect with God and raise our family under his word appropriately.
Yeah. And even like I'm reading so much of Hebrews just because it applies so much. And this is a passage that we've read a number of times with Resilient Church and between you and I, but it's like we read about Christ's sacrifice, which is once and for all, and this is why we can have an assurance of faith. And it says, therefore, brothers, after the author of Hebrews talks about how there's a reminder of sins every year, but then he quotes Jeremiah saying that Yahweh will no longer remember their sins and their lawless deeds. And he says, therefore, because of all these things that I've just said, right? Brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain that is through his flesh, and since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day draw near. And so that blood is for the sake of stirring up one another, and that blood is for the sake of loving each other and encouraging one another and meeting together as we ought to.
Yeah. So clean your home so that you can meet well together in the name of Jesus.
Yeah, because if you don't have a clean home, no one will want to come to your house.
It's true.
Right?
It's true. So clean your house for literally Christ's sake.
Yep.
And for your friend's sake and for your own sake.
Yes.
Man, what a strange story.
Strange story indeed.
A strange story indeed that, again, if you ask all of these series of questions and you do the deep diving into it, eventually you come around to something that can be really meaningful. And I'm walking away with that higher conviction to keep our kitchen clean.
Yeah.
It's significant.
Not just the kitchen, but the cat litter as well.
And yes, and the cat litter, as I always talk about. So, friends, thank you so much for tuning in again to this summer series we're doing called Stranger Stories. We got another one coming out next week, which we're super excited about too. It is equally as strange, but just as fruitful to our lives. So,
Yes.
friends, we love you, and we'll catch you here soon.